director de Economía de Estados Unidos en S&P Global Market Intelligence. Joel, thank you so much for having us a few minutes.
Quite pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Joel, U.S. GDP fell 0.9% in the second quarter. It's the second straight decline. My question is it a strong recession signal? Can we affirm that the U.S. economy is in a recession now?
I think the answer to that question is no, not yet. And let me elaborate. Yes, it's true that following today's report, we know that GDP in the United States fell for 2 consecutive quarters, and that is the popular definition of a recession. But here in the United States, the official arbiter of business cycle turning points is something called the Business Cycle Dating Committee of the National Bureau of Economic Research. And when making their determination of whether the U.S. economy has slipped into a recession or not, they look at many more factors than just the decline in GDP. In particular, they look at incomes, they look at measures of industrial production, and they look at measures of employment, all of which rose over the first half of the year here in the United States. So looking at all of the data that's available to us this morning, I think I would say that we do not have a configuration of information that meets the official definition of a recession here in the United States. So the answer to your question, the short answer to your question is, it's not a recession yet.
Okay, not a recession yet, but we have seen how the consensus GDP forecast for the second quarter was a gain of 0.3 or 0.5%, depending on the firm. And we are wondering why the consensus is wrong, because we see a wrong consensus last quarter too.
Well, the consensus forecast, you're right, was minus 0.3, minus 0.4. Our estimate was minus 1.3. I think it would be uncharitable to say that any of those estimates were incorrect, given the imprecision with which these things could be estimated. The very fact that we were able to anticipate that the second quarter number would be negative is actually a forecasting triumph. So I think I'm going to push back a little bit on your assessment that the consensus was incorrect on this.
And Joel, can we expect significant changes in next revisions? Because this is the first estimate, and yesterday we could listen Jerome Powell saying that this is only the first estimation, and we can see revisions, significant revisions.
Yes. So in the United States, the cycle of revisions for GDP is that 1 month from now we'll get a second estimate of the growth rate of the economy in the second quarter, and then a month after that we'll get the third and so-called final estimate until there are benchmark revisions sometimes later. So it is possible that today's number could be revised up, or it could be revised down. Another interesting aspect of all of this is that here in the United States, there are 2 different measures of aggregate economic activity. One is gross domestic product, which was reported this morning, but an alternative measure is gross domestic income, which is an attempt to measure the income received by people who produced all the goods and services that were purchased and are included in the measure of gross domestic product. In the first quarter of this year, GDP in the United States declined, but gross domestic income increased, giving conflicting signals on the economy's direction over the first quarter. This morning, we got the report that gross domestic product declined again in the second quarter, but we don't yet have an estimate of gross domestic income. That will be available for another month. So it's not even clear at this point that looking at all the data that our Bureau of Economic Analysis publishes, that the economy here in the US did actually contract over the first half of the year. And hence, I think the reluctance of the Business Cycle Dating Committee to define the current event as a recession yet.
And Joel, the exact words of Powell yesterday, he used expression we don't know in Spanish, but he used take the GDP with a grain of salt. He tried to said that we have to be prudent at the reading of this data. But which interpretation you must do of these words of Powell?
Right. So that is a parochial way of saying that gross domestic product is one piece of information that economic analysts should and do look at to assess the overall condition of the U.S. economy. It's not the only measure to look at. There are others that are giving conflicting signals right now. So I think he was warning us and maybe warning you in the media to not overreact to today's number should it prove to show a contraction in the economy in the second quarter, which in fact it did. So he's just signaling that we need to be cautious in not to overreact to today's number and to place it in a larger context of all the other information that we have at our disposal, which does suggest that the economy is, is still probably growing as we enter the second half of the year.
And what about next meetings, next policy monetary meetings? Because
yes.
Now, in September, we expect new macro projections, but Powell said that now he doesn't do a projection so detailed as we have seen now in the Federal Reserve. He insisted on acting according to data and moving meeting by meeting, and of course considering that now this data, this GDP that we have known today, it's inevitable to wonder how could the Fed move in September, considering this data and of course the evolution of inflation next month.
Right. All right. So this morning's number was widely anticipated by the time it was published. Okay. And of course, the staff at the Federal Reserve is one of the best in the world. So I have no doubt that at the time of the FOMC meeting earlier this week, they were well aware of the fact that today's number would show would show a decline in GDP for the second quarter. So that's important to keep in mind, because it means that today's number probably has no bearing whatsoever on the future conduct of monetary policy. What will be important is whether inflation starts to come down towards the Fed's 2% objective, okay, and whether going forward the economy weakens further and labor markets begin to loosen up. Now, I think it's pretty clear from the announcement that the Federal Reserve made following the meeting and comments that Chair Powell made during the press conference that he conducted later in the afternoon, that we should anticipate further increases in interest rates this year, probably getting the policy rate up to at least 3% by the end of the year. My own expectation and our own expectation here at S&P Global is that the Fed will raise its policy rate 50 basis points at the next meeting and probably 25 basis points at the following two meetings. But again, it will be partially data dependent as we go forward. But it's very obvious from the statements that the Fed is making that they intend to continue tightening monetary policy until they are convinced that they have kept inflation expectations under control and that they see some incremental decline in inflation rates as we're going forward.
Thank you so much, Joel Prakken from S&P Global Market Intelligence for this analysis. It's a pleasure.
All right, thank you very much.
Nosotros nos quedamos